The Cinders of Dezu, written and read by Tonic. A tyrant king, a missing girl, and a journey through a perilous world. Join me for this completed sci-fi fantasy novel, read as an audio series. Enjoy the story from here on, or binge from the beginning with the first episode. The episodes are now available on YouTube and Spotify as a podcast. Like and subscribe if you enjoy. My audiobooks are totally free. If you'd like to donate to support my writing, though, check out my Patreon in the description. And now, back to the tale. Chapter 19. Roots. So, what do you think? Raina was rolling it around in her mouth. It was very strange. It had the consistency that she was used to, as well as the sweetness, but not the cold temperature. It really wasn't cold at all. Orion was talking with his mouth full under his dark maroon hood. It's one of my favorites now. I can get ice cream, like the real thing. It's not impossible, but this is much easier to find, and now it's part of me since I grew up here. The large woman behind the stand with dreaded green hair and pink skin finished with another customer in line and then turned to them again. Good? She asked. Raina thought she reminded her of a watermelon starburst. I don't know yet. She still won't tell me, the king said. I love the way you make it, Miss Peepo. You know yours is my favorite. The pink woman's cheeks got even more pink, if that were possible, and she bashfully waved off the compliment. Oh, stop it, you. Raina took another bite. She shook her head. Overall, I think I still miss ice cream, she said. Orion nodded. Yeah, it's hard to top the real thing. Ice cream was one of my few joys as a kid on the other side. But Tonic is made of the cream of the gorna tree and the ground-up nut butter of the mitu seeds. It comes together really well. Then, of course, they add different fruits and things for different flavors. He turned to Miss Peepo. And you had better never stop making your family's recipe. As he spoke, he slipped a large coin out of his loose sleeve and slid it onto the edge of her stand. Her eyes got wide as she picked it up and quickly held it to her chest. Bless you, Your Majesty. She had tears in her eyes. Orion put his fingers to his lips and darted his eyes over to the new customers approaching. Oh! As she turned around to tend to her patrons, Orion gave Raina a tap on the arm to indicate they needed to take their leave. The two slipped back into the bustling crowd. It was a busy day at this town Orion had called Practice. He said they were preparing to celebrate the annual Festival of Tomasi. Orion told her he often visited towns while keeping a low profile, but he particularly loved to visit before and, if possible, during festivals. But this time he had another reason to be there. You didn't get to ask her about the doctor, said Raina. I know, he said. I think we could find someone more in the know about him, though. Mallard doesn't always run in the market social circles. Honestly, he really doesn't run in any social circles. Raina saw a little girl holding a small furry animal close to her chest. She was looking around frantically at the faces above her. Relief washed over her face as she reached the nearby hand of a young man in the crowd. So, you're sure you trust the people you sent to find Kai and Julian? Raina asked. Orion kept her hand as they weaved through a tightly bunched group of people. Definitely. My people are close. You'll be with them again in no time. Raina was quiet until they reached another stand. Orion greeted the neon yellow man with bright green eyes, whose face nearly lit up immediately with recognition. She looked at her feet, standing still in the bustling shuffle of the feet around her with places to go. Aren't you worried or anything? She said. Huh? Orion said, turning back to her as the man at the stand went to retrieve something. You said they got taken by someone dangerous, but you think they're still okay? Sure, little one. He knelt down and looked her in the eye from under his hood. I'm not worried in the slightest, and neither should you. Raina's face was doubtful. The neon yellow man came back and got the king's attention again. Raina was too consumed in her own concerns to hear them. Orion smiled, and Raina caught him pulling another large, shiny coin to lay on the stand in front of the man. A look of intense gratitude washed over his face, too, as he quickly slipped it from the stand and into his pocket. The king grabbed his hand and brought him in for an embrace over the table, and then headed back into the crowd with Raina. What do you keep giving them? Raina asked. Oh, it's a valin. It's about a week's wage for most merchants. Oh, Raina said. That's nice. What did he tell you? He gave me a tip, the king said. They were making their way past a group of market patrons who had formed a circle. In the center, two large blue and orange feathered birds the size of ostriches with long curved beaks danced back and forth with riders on their backs. Raina thought they were fighting at first, but then realized it looked more like play fighting. What's that? She asked. It's an old tradition for Tomasi. It's a little bit like a play that acts out part of the story. Orion gently nudged her back to keep her moving as he spoke. What's the story? She asked. It's kind of a long one, plus we're already here, the king said as he gestured to a rather solid-looking cabin just ahead of them. It had gray wood paneling and a black door with a guard posted out front. He was large but looked young with his chest puffed out. Raina thought he looked like he was taking his job very seriously. Orion waved to him as they approached and stroked his goatee. The guard's serious and furrowed brow loosened in surprise as he realized who he was. He stood at attention and smiled as he stepped aside. Orion stood in front of the door a moment. The young man nearly jumped as he started frantically grabbing for his keys. He fumbled trying to unlock the door before opening it quickly with a creak. Orion patted him on the shoulder as he headed in. Raina followed him into a dimly lit series of rooms. It looked like a really small hotel hallway with creaky wooden floors and only a few rooms. Orion went 2 doors down to his right and knocked. Mallard, he called. Mallard, it's me. Raina could hear rustling behind the door. It's me, came the muffled voice from the other side. The door cracked open. It's me. It's you. It was a middle-aged man with turquoise skin and a full head of black hair that sloped to the side. Yes, Mallard, me. The turquoise man dropped his head as he looked his cloaked figure up and down. He didn't say anything as he stared in his face for a second. Orion raised an eyebrow. Oh, right. He stepped aside to let the king in. Raina looked up at him as she passed, and Mallard gave her a puzzled look. The girl? Who is, She's an associate, Mallard, to business. What happened? Orion said. Yes, well, the touches I made to the experiments weren't enough. The thing responded like you said. I didn't want to damage it irreparably, so I leaned on the side of... You're in a safe house, Mallard. Let's address that first, the king said. What happened? Raina sat on a small stool in the corner of the dimly lit room. There wasn't much inside the small quarters. There were several candles sitting on hanging shelves on the walls, the stool with a small table in the corner where Raina sat, and a bed. A few books lined the walls in stacks with some knickknacks and tools strewn about. There were no windows, which Raina thought was odd. Orion sat on the bed as Mallard looked away. He went to the door to make sure it was locked before speaking. He turned around with round eyes to the king. It wasn't safe with it. I wasn't. It just wasn't safe. Orion motioned to him. Do you at least have it with you? Mallard gave a quick sigh and went to the side of his bed. He pulled up a wide canvas bag and reached in it with both of his arms. Gently, he began wedging his hands back and forth, pulling something out. It took a moment before he produced a large spherical ball. Raina leaned forward to let her eyes adjust to the light a bit more. It was dark brown and looked like a large entangled ball of soot-mired roots. Orion stood and carefully lifted it from Mallard's hands. He peered into it like he was looking for something. "It looks good," he said softly.
Sure," said Mallard. "I refuse to risk any kind of disfigurement at all, like I said, and I was thorough. But this thing, I can't make heads or tails of it. I mean, it's a mechanism of some kind. You referred to it as a weapon? And if it is, then all I can deduce is that it's a lever for that weapon. A lever that, when pulled, makes something somewhere do something. But I simply don't have enough information, not enough responses to stimulus to observe before the hunting started."
"Hunting?" the king asked. Mallard nodded.
"I'm being hunted, Your Highness."
Orion's countenance fell. "How do you know?" Raina's ears and nose caught a sound and a scent that both distracted and disturbed her. She looked down and around on the floor until she spotted movement in the corner. She got up to get a closer look. Ants. It was a trickling of them coming through a crack in the wall. The trickling became a current as more and more started coming through. She traced the trim around the room and noticed more separate streams coming in through the bottoms of the walls. She looked to the corners and saw more. Then, along with the ants, she noticed more. A worm managed its way out of the floorboard next to Orion's foot, while the two men were still deep in conversation. A beetle started crawling its way up the leg of the small table. The creeping things were silent and odorless to most anyone else, but to Raina, she was overwhelmed by the essence of the creature's expressions. It was fear.
"Excuse," she started to say to the men. "Excuse me."
Mallard was still talking.
"The sounds in the night, I thought they were just the heaving of the older foundations, but—"
Raina put her arm on Orion's shoulder.
"Excuse me, please,"
she said as the king turned his attention to her.
"There's something—"
They all felt the increase of a vibration under their feet. Orion looked around the room and stood up. "Out, now." Mallard stammered and looked around at his things. Raina ran to the door and undid the bolt lock. She opened the door with Orion close behind. They ran down the hallway and heard a scream from one of the other rooms to their right. As they went outside into the sunlight, Raina looked back and noticed Orion still clutching the root ball, tucking it carefully and securely under his arm. The guard was gone. No, Raina saw he was just ahead of them. He had his weapon drawn. It was a curved blade with a straight-ribbed hilt. He was out in the crowd of running and panicked people, attempting to usher them in an orderly fashion. A man riding one of the large, beaked, colorful birds came bounding up to her. It squawked in terror and gained air as it leapt itself and its rider over her. Her gaze followed it up and over her head before it landed and melded into the crowd. As more hurried people passed, Raina saw the young guard just ahead lose his footing. He fell as he tried to turn back around in Raina's direction. His face was of horror as the ground beneath him cracked and gave way. He reached out to her and the king before he was sucked underground. "No!" Orion cried, running just ahead of her. He was reaching for where the guard had disappeared when a loud crack rang out behind them. They both whipped around to see the safe house they had just left beginning to lurch backwards. The back of the structure began sinking into the open ground. The face of the house was angled up like a head trying to keep its mouth above water. Raina felt herself get whisked around by the shoulders until she was facing the king again. "Take this," he said. He handed her the root sphere. His eyes were intense and pleading. "Promise me you'll guard this with your life and leave the walls. I need to make sure this village isn't lost."
"I promise,"
said Raina, eyes shimmering in fear. The king removed his cloak and turned toward the crowd. As it fell to the ground, Raina could see on the back of his coal gray sleeveless vest was the stitched embroidery of a bull with horns on its head and horns where its nostrils should be. As Orion leapt into the air, she felt a rush of heat under his feet as his body propelled him higher. A few stopped as they caught a glimpse of him. A ripple of voices could be heard crying out amongst the panic.
Orion? Was that the king?
Raina turned and started running with the root ball held in her arms before she could see where he landed. She didn't look back, although the commotion increased. Loud popping and booming could be heard with more scraping of dirt. People were screaming. The ball in her hands seemed firm and also somehow fragile. She was scared, but she didn't dare squeeze it too hard. She followed the path as best she could through the town as she dodged people and animals and carts being rushed around and out of the village walls. She soon found a stream of people heading out, which she blended herself into. Raina knew how to follow instructions. As much guff as she often gave her dad, she knew sometimes you had to listen. He had taught her that. She resented him sometimes for always telling her what to do, but he set the example. On set, she often saw him listening very carefully to his directors, no matter how frustrating they seemed to be. He told her, nobody is their own boss all the time, and you can't go through life pretending like you are. So as she reached the gate of the city marked practice, she decided now was a really good time to listen, even if she didn't know what was going on. She felt the ground rumble underneath her, like a current was just beneath her feet. It was so distinct that she turned around as it left her. She saw a man's donkey stomp hooves in reaction to the vibration that had just slinked under him. She noticed the cracks in the ground here, too, were oozing little creatures of the earth. She kept her pace outside the city a ways on the main road. It quivered with slinking rumbles. It wasn't like an earthquake exactly, but it was disturbing and kept people on the road still startled and in a panic. Some leaving the city were talking about what they had seen before they left.
"It was massive, covered in dirt,"
said a young girl.
"Did you see him? He pounded the ground with fire,"
said a pointy-eared teenage boy.
"Our protector even still,"
sighed a middle-aged mother to her strikingly green-eyed child. Raina went into the forest once she had decided the main road was too crowded and too risky with whatever the danger seemed to be. She didn't know where to go as she wandered through the trees, and finally slowed down once she felt she was far enough away from the noise and commotion. There was no rumbling here in this clearing, with a large, flat brown stone surrounded by a very green, leafy carpet. She sat down to look at the object she carried. She held it up to her face and noticed it looked like it was burning. Not a full flame, but a smolder, creeping up specific thin strands. It looked like quick-burning, thin kindling that she'd seen in fireplaces, but the smolders were light yellow glows, coating and burning up the small roots. It wasn't the whole ball, just little parts of it. There was no heat, even as she lightly brushed her fingers against it to check. It looked almost pretty, decorated in smoldering and flickering glows that appeared and disappeared, and then reappeared elsewhere on the ball. Then she felt something strange as she gazed into it. It looked pretty, but the whole thing started to make her feel sick. She didn't know why. It was a pit in her stomach sick, like she had done something wrong and needed to tell on herself to clear her conscience. But there was nothing to tell. It was just the feeling. It laid on her chest like a brick and sat on her stomach like a stone. After a moment, she felt her eyes start to well up with tears. What was this thing? What was happening? She was so caught up in it that she didn't notice the forest around her grow still. A tension grew in the air. Raina felt eyes on her. This feeling was secondary to the strange sadness and guilt she felt, and for a moment, the sensation felt blended in with this whole strange experience. She wouldn't have snapped out of her focus if it weren't for the sound of a loud and angry chuff. Raina looked past the tangled, flickering roots. There, at the edge of the clearing, were two large eyes glaring at her with a fury she had never seen. They were on either side of the wide head of a bull, yet its long, sharp horns on its head were matched with a second set protruding from where its nostrils should be. Instead, its actual nostrils were slits like a reptile on the front of its face, just above the bottom set of horns. They flared in anger as it chuffed again. The beast was a deep navy blue, with high raised shoulders and a beautiful dark blue mane that ran down the length of its back. Its tail whipped in irritation. Raina was frozen. Her mind raced for options as the beast scraped the ground with its hoof. The moment felt like a surreal nightmare. The thing was about to charge her. It was all happening so fast. Suddenly, she felt something like a mental and emotional sync with the animal. She lowered the ball of roots from her face and made a low rumble in her throat. The alien-looking bull stopped scraping the ground. Its powerful legs stood firm. Raina rumbled again. The thing's eyes began to soften. Raina stood up and put her arm out. She made a call to it that started out low, then went high briefly, then low again. The bull lost the anger in its eyes, but stayed in position. It then lifted its head and made a deep warbling vocalization. Raina was about to back up, but then recognized the sound. She was safe. That was when she felt a warm hand on her shoulder. "Get back, Raina." It was Orion's voice. The bull lowered its head, and its eyes filled with fury again. "No, no!" Raina whispered urgently. "I know your power, but it's a sovereign bull. There's no reasoning with it." He yanked her back behind him. She saw his armor was seared and scraped with mud and dirt. "Please, I almost had him." A guttural bellow rang out from the bull as it reared back. "Leave, now!" Raina stumbled back as Orion reached his hand back to push her. She saw Orion hurl a magnificent stream of flame at the charging beast. She turned and ran into the trees. She wasn't far before she felt the unforgiving heat of the battle behind her. She ran behind a large boulder still clutching the root ball. Over the top and to the side of it, she saw the trees bend to the heat and ignite. A loud swirl of flames was tearing at the tops of the branches above her and trying to wrap itself around the boulder. She was protected, but the heat was almost unbearable. Through it all, she could hear the bellow of the sovereign bull continue unabated, in chorus with the desperate cries of the king. Finally, the heat stopped, and the flames were literally sucked from the branches above her, leaving them burnt, but not smoldering. She heard the bellow continue, and the king's cries were getting more and more reduced. He was in agony. Slowly, he became silent, and the bellow of the bull became grunts mixed with heavy stomps to the ground. It wasn't long before she heard the gallop of the creature receding into the woods beyond. Raina stepped out from behind the boulder and made her way back to where she had left the king. On the other side of the now burnt and charred clearing was a mangled and gored Orion. Raina screamed and ran to him. She dropped to her knees over his punctured and broken chest. "No! No! Orion, no!" Through bloody teeth, he tried to comfort her. "Shh, shh," he said. Get, I'm going to be fine." His breath was labored and wheezing. Raina's tears wet his face. "What do I do? Is there something?" Listen, he said in a hushed tone. "The weapon you have, the ball." Raina looked down at the thing tucked under her arm as he spoke. "It's important, Raina. It's critical to..." He grunted as he tried to shift his weight. "My people,
They need you to find out what it is. To protect them. I need you to protect them. No, Orion, I don't know what to do. You can't die. Don't die, she cried.
Orion winced as he released a weak chuckle.
No one is going to die, little one, he said. Thankfully, there are more secrets here than you know.
Hey guys, it's Oliver. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more. Give me your thoughts in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. And check my channel to make sure you're caught up on the latest episode. I'll have regular episodes up until all chapters of this story are fully released, so stay tuned.